Hey guys, I'm back from my hiatus that was never announced or advertised. Um, I'm through a rough couple of months, still going on, but I really like making videos, and so I'm forcing myself to make some more. Today, we're going to talk about something that I've done before. Um, if you know a lot about me, you might know that I went to college for an English degree. Super fucking useful. And while I was there, part of my graduation was called the senior seminar, right? Think of it like your people talk about their thesis or their senior project or whatever, part of graduation. Um, so for ours, it was run by a very brilliant woman who taught me a ton about literature. And her idea for the senior seminar was that everybody had to teach a 2 week literature course to the other seniors, and it was really cool. And putting together that course, I learned a lot about science fiction, and so I'm going to go over the history of science fiction. This is going to be part one. This is going to need to be at least three parts, but I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. There's a lot of documentaries about this stuff. I'll give you the names of those once we get to round part three if you want to learn more about it. But I'll just give you the quick and down and dirty, basically. So back about so many thousands of years ago, this this Epic of Gilgamesh was written down. Right now, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily consider that science fiction. It might classify it as mythology. Some would even classify it as fantasy. Wouldn't get a lot of love as science fiction, but it's important to the history of science fiction. For one, because it's fiction that was written down. That wasn't that common at the time. If you look at the history of literacy, we don't get a lot of fiction written down until literacy rates start going up, mainly because like writing was just a very labor intensive thing that only a few people could do. So it was mostly spent on economics and religion, right? Um, and while there uh, was some literature, a lot of that was more like for a historical record. I'm not saying there wasn't fiction written down, just that it becomes a lot more common as literacy increases. Um, and around the time of the Epic of Gilgamesh, literacy was basically like the priesthood and the accountants. And sometimes both as they overlapped. So they wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Epic of Gilgamesh features a few sci-fi themes like visitors from other dimension, um, helping out humanity, man's folly, things like that. Give it a check if you're ever so inclined. I can't recommend a specific translation because I've read a couple different ones. I don't know Sumerian, so I don't know which is the best translation. I'm not that kind of scholar. I know that there are a few translations that are written a little more like prose, and so it's a little more straightforward. And then there are some that try and retain the more poetic style. Um, so it's really about personal preference with those. Um, you can do research and find out which one you like. I honestly don't have a recommendation on it. So then time keeps marching on, and we've got a few more uh, important examples. We've got Utopia, right? Utopia is an interesting read because it's still really before the concept of fiction comes around, right? And it's an alternate universe tale, basically, where this guy visits a land that he admits like isn't part of our world, right? And he talks about like their differences in things like wealth and economics and things like that. Bunch of really interesting details. For example, in Utopia, they still have slavery, but the slaves' chains are made of gold. Um, That's some interesting stuff, right? So we keep going. A few hundred years later, we get Mary Shelley, right? Um, Percy Shelley's uh, wife, but well-respected author in her own right, which, she was a woman in the 1800s writing a science fiction story, one of the first. She's often credited as being sort of like the mother of science fiction. So, hold on a second. My dog is letting me know that he needs my attention. And I'm not editing this video, so I'm going to be right back because I'm going to go let him in and tell him he's a good boy, because he's a good boy. Hey, buddy, you want to come in? Come in. Good boy. He's a good boy. He's right here. That's his tail hitting the wall and the door. So, Mary Shelley, she's often credited with, when she wrote Frankenstein, she is credited as like giving birth to science fiction. There were some science fiction ideas and some tropes that are predating that, but that's really where she's setting out with the conceit that this is a fictional but scientific story. And it's got a few things that become common in science fiction too, discussing like the meaning of humanity, casting the villain as a victim. That's the really the cool one. It really confuses me sometimes to see people surprised at that, because it's not subtle, as most writing from that time was not subtle. She makes it very clear that the real villain is not the monster. The real monster is not Adam. It's Victor Frankenstein. So I don't know how people miss that, but then again, people miss a lot of shit all the time because they don't want to think critically. That's okay. I can't make them. And getting frustrated about it doesn't fix it. So then we go on. Mary Shelley has a lot of success with that. She's writing about something based in science, because at the time there was a huge vivisectionist movement. That's where we got like the Island of Dr. Moreau and everything's based around that. Another thing, people don't really consider it because they're more familiar with the movie adaptations. Island of Dr. Moreau, he was not genetically modifying anything. He was vivisecting animals. He was cutting them and then sewing them back together in human shapes and then forcing them to act human. And that's where they gained their sentience. Crazy and gruesome. So we get into H.G. Wells and Jules Verne at the turn of the century, right? And this is where it becomes very important in the history of science fiction to look at different styles, because H.G. Wells and Jules Verne had very different approaches, right? And a lot of people like to just sort of lump the two together. Jules Verne, it was said by people that knew him at the time, whenever he was doing any kind of story, he would try to ground everything he could in fact, right? Even if he was speculating about some things, he would only speculate so far. Everything had to go back to a base root of fact. And so he'd be at the library poring over things like when he wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He's going over submersible technology and what we know about ocean depths and things like that. Because he wants to write an exciting story, but he still wants everything in his story to be as realistic as possible. H.G. Wells is the birth of what we call sociological science fiction, right? I've used the term before a lot, actually, when I'm talking online. Sociological science fiction is something that comes around with things like the Twilight Zone, and despite some people trying to call it hard sci-fi, things like Star Trek, where the science is there, right? It's not necessarily accurate, because the accuracy of the science must always take a back seat to telling a story about humanity, where we are, where we're going, where we've been, whichever it is. Sociological science fiction is talking about that. So you've got Jules Verne, who is ostensibly, he's telling an adventure story, right? That's what's going on with Jules Verne. And he might be telling an adventure story about a futuristic submarine city, or he might be telling an adventure story about a trip to the moon, right? But he's mainly telling a story about what happens because the technology made it possible. While Jules Verne, right, is doing that, H.G. Wells is going sort of the opposite direction. He's saying this technology that I'm mentioning, whether possible or not, it's more of a storytelling device so I can tell you about society and humanity, right? And that's a big split that a lot of people don't really realize has occurred, right? It's still there today. The science fiction that's going on, the example I give is the difference between Analog magazine and Asimov's magazine, right? Both great science fiction magazines. But there's a certain kind of reader for Asimov's and a certain kind of reader for Analog. And even when there's overlap between those two kind of readers, they still have their own views on what makes good science fiction, right? So that's where I'm going to end part 1 today. Part 2, we're going to start getting into the pulps, the scientific romances, things like that, starting at the turn of the century with everyone getting their inspiration from Wells and Verne, and then going in their own direction afterwards. There's going to be a lot more adventure and a lot more excitement, and this is the roots of our science fiction today. So I want to thank you guys for joining me. It is good to be back. Like I said, going through a lot of personal things, and major depressive episodes and economic difficulties, financial difficulties, broken down car, and just the stress of the holiday season. Everything piling up on top of each other. It has not made being me or being around me very fun at all for the past few months. But I did tell you guys that I was going to be giving you content, and I don't want to be a liar. And this is what I like doing, and I can let depression take away my motivation, but I can choose and refuse to let depression take away my discipline. And so that's what I'm choosing here. I may not have the most motivation, but I do have the discipline to do this and to talk to you guys. My updates may not be the regular Monday, Wednesday, Friday ones that I wanted to do originally, that I set out to do, mainly because I have months of content to catch up on. And I'm going to just be recording and releasing things as they're done. I've mentioned that before. So I will see you guys in a day or two, maybe. Take it easy. Thank you for joining me. If you're watching and you need a shout out to your own artistic endeavors, be you a writer, an artist, a fellow YouTuber, anything, go ahead and hit me up. I always like supporting the community, and that's one of the reasons that I started Touchbone in the first place, is so that we all have a network together where we support each other, right? So everybody have a great what is it? Thursday? Everybody have a great Thursday, and I will see you later. Bye.